Okay, welcome everyone to the Cartographer office hours, Monday, January 24th. We're glad that you're joining us live, and welcome Mr. Scott Rosenberg. Glad to have you here, one of our top contributors and overall great community supporter for many of the open source projects here. So welcome, Scott. Okay, let me share here my screen. There you go. Okay, regarding note taking, anyone from you want to volunteer? Be a note taker?
I can do it.
Thank you, Mari. Thank you. Okay, and yeah, feel free to add yourself to the attendee list. It's great how Scott Andrews does that using the add capabilities on Google Docs. Thank you. Okay, that's great. Remember that the goal of this space is to discuss potentially architecture changing ideas or improvement, general improvement ideas for the project. And also you can bring your questions here for the maintainers team to address, right? So today we have at least one discussion topic, a really interesting one that has at least one issue related to it. So it's what requires an RFC, what do RFCs even look like? Yeah, it's from Mari. We
Yeah.
already started that conversation December the 6th. Again, having here some ideas on when to RFC, when not to RFC. But I just wanted to give Mari a space to introduce the idea.
Yeah, it would be nice if more of the maintainers were here right now. But internally, we've just been discussing what needs an RC and what doesn't. And there still seems to be a lack of agreement on that question. And there seems to be a lack of an agreement on what an RFC looks like in terms of the scale, size, and scope of what it covers. I wrote in there, see the notes from 12.6 because we did have this conversation as you noted. I'm not exactly sure what was left unanswered from that conversation, but it does seem like we're still not in agreement. But as I said, there aren't enough maintainers here for this discussion to happen, probably.
Yeah, that's true. One of the I don't know if it's an outcome, but one of the observations from that discussion was to explore how other CNCF or other projects out there does that. Already added that to the issue. There's at least one outstanding issue regarding RFC, the RFC process. If you search for RFC issues, there are some others that ask for improvements on the RFC process or clarification. I pointed out here at least 2 projects out there who already have an established RFC process. Thank you, Stephen. That's great. I have here, for example, an RFC, an actual RFC from the React project. And they have a whole structure already documented on when to RFC, when not to RFC, how is the step-by-step process. But the common baseline there was when a feature was to be introduced or when a feature was going to be removed. That was something that classified for an RFC. This one is for build packs. Yeah, that's interesting. I will put it here.
Yeah, the build packs one is actually an RFC that talks about what changes need an RFC for the most part. It also kind of establishes what the RFC process for that project is. I'd really recommend we do something similar where we document, either through the RFC process itself. This was like one of the early like the fourth RFC we had in the project. Is after the first three, we realized we needed, more definition. And so I'd recommend we do something similar where someone opens an RFC that says, this is what the process looks like. Here's a final comment period. Here are approvers. Right now, we don't have a concept of who approves RFCs. And I think that's a gap too, because I think it means they kind of sit sometimes. On that topic of what kinds of changes, right? Like, how do you describe substantial? This change is substantial enough that it needs more purview. An easy way to start is anything that's user facing, anything that affects the user experience of Cartographer. If it's, that might sound like a lot of things, but an RFC doesn't have to be extremely low level. It can be a high level thing that says, here's this big feature we need, right? And all of the parts of it, the smaller details, even if they're user interface details in some cases, right, could come out through the work, or it could be more narrow and about a specific thing that we haven't talked about, but it should still go through that process of getting consensus that, yes, this is what we're going to do it. Yes, everybody's seen it. And yes, the people have signed off on it.
It sounds from that every feature story has to have been an RFC.
Well, every feature story should be covered by an RFC, but I don't know if that means that every feature story should map one-to-one to an RFC. Also, like, feature story tends to be that's a word from a different process, if that makes sense. It's not often used in the open source context. And so if you're thinking about that as like what I would think on an internal team as a feature story coming from a product manager or something, I would say, tracking something like that can exist internally, but the way it should enter the project is as a proposal it could come from anybody, the community, or somebody who works on the project more regularly. But that's the primary way, as you're talking about introducing that feature, that it should be discussed in the open source context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it sounds like then if we were to adopt that, if there were a story in the project backlog that was not marked as chore, and we do still have things marked as chores, if we couldn't tie it to an RFC, that should be a code smell that we weren't meeting this process that's being proposed.
Yep, I think that seems right. Like, again, when you talk about a story there, it almost implies that the story comes first and then you figure out an RFC, to cover it. I think the way I see it more is, a need is identified, right? And then you start with an RFC that covers, hey, here's the big high level, this is the feature we need. Over time, it gets refined into something that covers enough of the user experience that we're comfortable saying everything else can be left up to the team working on it. And then it gets broken down into GitHub issues, right? That are kind of, it's more like the user stories are on the other end. And some, that say, here's this first part, here's this next part, here's this next part. And then, whoever's responsible for different parts of the code base or whatever, however you want to organize it, right? Folks start working on those GitHub issues, and then eventually the RFC is complete.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense in terms of a forward working process. I mentioned stories in the backlog because we do have issues in the backlog that right now aren't tied to RFCs, but do talk about changing the user-facing behavior.
That makes sense. I think maybe it's just the word like backlog there kind of implies a sorted list of things that people who work on the project are supposed to work on them in a certain order. But in an open source project, you're going to have a lot of contributions from internally you have a backlog is kind of separate from open source context where different things are going to land in the order that different contributors land them. So it's just that backlog concept that I'd maybe not focus on in the open source context. Cool. Sorry to keep badgering on that point.
No, that's fine.
Sounds like an action item to make an RFC to define an RFC process. I can take that. I don't know what the process is for approving that, but
You
we'll
could
find
put
out.
it put it in the RFC. Sorry, James.
Do other than like at some point calling like ultimately either we're going for a consensus or a democratic process. The history of the last 6 months makes me think that a consensus, like tying ourselves to require consensus, would be too much. So my instinct is we just have to have some point when we just ask for a vote. Is that? I'm curious if other people think that that tracks.
Is your question like, at what point do you say, okay, I think this is ready for people to approve, or something like that in the context of an RFC?
Yeah, I don't think that for all the RCs that have been approved so far, I think that we generally have just had a process where we were just like, where we just had a conversation. We're like, okay, it's getting approved, right, and then we're like, okay, yeah, it's approved. I assume that part of what we are moving towards is either during one of these meetings or in an async process, we're just going to say like, okay, everybody in favor, put your hand up. Everybody opposed, put your hand up. A majority, a supermajority is required. This passes or fails.
Yeah. So GitHub has a like on a PR. If you do your RFCs through PRs, you can use GitHub's like ability to approve a PR in order to handle that. And there's some nice, like, you can create like a team alias of the people who are supposed to approve. They get added automatically when it's created, and so they all get a request to approve. There's some nice automation that GitHub offers. Again, a point to Cloud Native Build Packs is like, you could kind of check out what how it works there. But generally, whoever opened the RFC, you could, one process is you could keep it in draft until it's ready to be approved, and then when it flips from draft, it means okay, you're ready for people to start adding approvals. Approvals can happen asynchronously for sure, right? Over a longer period of time, even.
Also, you mentioned one thing, and hopefully we don't get to that situation, but you mentioned like if some people disagree and some people agree, and then there's kind of some overall decision. Hopefully, with all of these things, so we can get to a general consensus. I think. I mean, I know that doesn't happen always, but I think in a lot of things I've seen, if people have good reasons to say to decline something, or then we should try hard to kind of address those concerns and understand, have empathy, and then try and convert that into some kind of agree and commit status. I think it shouldn't be just I've said a reject on this one and it gets overruled. We don't want to be having people feel like that. I think that doesn't create a good environment. So ultimately, things will happen. Maybe everybody won't always be on the right page, but I think we should just try and encourage that we address people's concerns. So if we do put something down as a reject, maybe it's with context to say this is what we can do for the next steps to turn that into an approval, potentially that kind of thing.
Yeah, a lot of times on Cloud Native Build Packs, for example, we'll have one person who isn't a super majority, wouldn't be a super majority who disapproves, and other people aren't willing to proceed without them, if they're strongly opposed, saying yes, okay, I'm comfortable with this. It doesn't have to be a legalistic process. It can be very towards the spirit of everybody agrees in the direction it goes. It's just helpful to have a process that lets you organize how do you achieve getting to a resolution.
That does sound like then what we are looking for is a consensus process. Like that would be what would be written up in the
When you say consensus, do you mean universal agreement? Or do you mean like general agreement, which might mean that not everyone agrees?
I heard, I mean, what I was hearing from Stephen and James was you work until everybody is, until that last person is like, I don't think this is necessarily the best way forward, but I'll put my John Hancock on it so that we can make forward progress. That sounds to me like a consensus process, not a majoritarian or democratic process.
Maybe it needs to go flip it on its head slightly. Is if you have a reason to say to not approve, then make that known with comments and try and get to that. It's on you to get that to a good review, a positive review. Like the risk is that if you put a negative and it just grinds to a halt, and then that's really bad for everybody involved. So I think if we're just trying to encourage always continue moving forward, and trying to come up with solving problems, then we should try and, if we passionately really don't agree with something, it's okay, how about this? Or it's engaging in that level.
I don't disagree with anything that you're saying there. And I think that healthy organizations certainly work that way. But I'm also trying to figure out, like, in our RFC process, what happens when that person says, like, when we get to the thorny problem, and we have two individuals who are just saying, like, I really think this is the wrong thing, guys. Like, I hear you. I think we're all like working in good faith, and I just disagree. I've been involved in so many different organizations where, like, that that happens, and for the most part, the rules, the process is, well, it's we have a democratic process, and you either need 50% plus one, or you need 2/3 or 3/5 or whatever. But, like, ultimately, there's not only the reliance uh, um, on people, like, good intention, and there's not only the reliance on good intention and on practices of how to have good discussions, productive discussions, but also there's just, like, some way to figure out what's the tie break.
I think on paper it is majoritarian. They're a majoritarian process, if that makes sense. It's just in spirit, right? We should aim more for consensus, not for blind checking boxes, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think some of the governance rules for other CNCF projects you could use to, supermajority, majority, however you want to cut it, and then you can use GitHub to kind of enforce that.
All right. Well, like it did on December 6th, it sounds like we've come to an agreement. Maybe formalizing this in an RFC will cause us to stay in agreement, hopefully. So I'll open an RFC.
Really appreciate it. That's great.
That's great. Okay, any other comment regarding the RFC process? We will continue discussion async in the throughout the RFC, but any other comment here? No. Okay, cool. We had a couple of action items from last session. Well, I don't know, RFC to specify inclusion of conventions, and branch or new repo to imbibe convention service. Yeah, I don't know, probably if Scott Andrews could refer to it if there's a timeline for this or any other discussion that is needed.
I think the action items left the team to decide whether or not they wanted to go with the mono repo or whether to break things apart.
Yeah, because last session, I believe we didn't document the complete conclusion regarding that, right?
Doesn't look like it's in the notes. My memory is of Marty kind of summing up that his read on the group was that there wasn't consensus among the maintainers that it should be a monorepo, that there was some hesitancy there. I bring that up in part because I'm definitely in that camp. I would also say that like the flip side of that is that I remain a little hesitant about adding convention service to Cartographer, but my impression of the group was that there's wide agreement otherwise that bringing it on would be something like that there was wide agreement. Yeah, like let's bring it on, but I don't think there was agreement to bring it on as a monorepo. Feel free to disagree with my with my.
That is how I recall it ending as well, for what it's worth.
It's a problem that we don't have enough for the team here.
Yeah. So what is the steps on this? Have we? I wonder. Do we need to get this onto the RFC or something captured somewhere? How do we? I guess how do we move this forward? Is that the case?
Yep. So I generally think that whether or not a cartographer is a monorepo is orthogonal to whether or not convention service makes sense within the umbrella of cartographer. I'm using the term umbrella there loosely. So like if cartographer decides that it's appropriate to decompose into multiple repos, and I think conventions can make sense as one of those repos. Like if cartographer otherwise doesn't think it makes sense at this point to split into other repos, I think conventions would just be another chunk of code in the same repo.
Just a thought, I guess. I suspect there's going to be some integrations and some adapters getting started fairly soon. I'd imagine they will probably be in separate repos because they will be, when packaged. Given the previous discussions that the team's been kind of saying, having this more microservice style as opposed to the monorepo style. So I'm imagining even if the current one doesn't split out straight away, maybe there's more coming soon that would adopt that approach. Is that a fair statement? When we see some external integrations getting built in the open source, would you expect them to be as a pull request onto the existing cartographer repo? Would you expect a new repo to be created?
A new repo, probably, in my opinion.
Yeah. My impression was that there's both the question of where does the code for the convention service go, and then where does the code for the conventions go? And my understanding was that, one, it wasn't even clear that the conventions that have currently been written would be, but also that that code can sit totally separate from convention service.
To just
Scott,
clarify
feel free
that,
to jump in.
Conventions are not part of this proposal, other than like we have a couple samples that we can throw in. But like the other conventions that exist today Like whether or not those go open source is like a separate conversation. And even if it's decided that like, yes, these things should be open source, like it's not at all obvious to me that they belong in Cartographer.
In terms of how to move the RC forward, right now the RC is written with some unresolved questions. It feels like having had some open discussions, and we can definitely talk about some of about all or any of those questions right now. The RFC should take a position on those, and then we should go through a process of like doing the up or down, yes, I agree, no, or I disagree. Yeah, one of those questions, that first one is, should convention service be a separate repo or exist in the same repo? And I think that there's some disagreement between the most maintainers and the author of the RFC. I would welcome
And just to be
Scott
clear, like I'm happy to go either way. I just want it to be consistent. Like if Cartographer is a monorepo, then I don't think conventions as a separate repo makes sense. If Cartographer is a set of repos, then I think a separate repo does make sense. That's my standing.
I think as we discussed last week, we're not in agreement about that being the way we make this decision, right? Like I think the rest of the maintainers are not yet in agreement about that line of reasoning.
I was objecting to the RFC author being out of alignment with the maintainers that Washima mentioned. I think the maintainers can figure out what they want, and then this RFC can align with that.
I would
like this RFC is very
point
much
to
not
that as
taking
like,
an opinion one way or the other.
I would even tying that decision, like tying those two things together as like necessary for like how does this decision get made, is a point of disagreement. So I don't think that the status of runnable as within this repo or not should affect whether the convention service is within this repo or not. And like I hear your reasoning, I just don't agree.
Right, that's what I was trying to convey before as well. Meaning, are you okay with us or with the maintainers making the decision about mono repo or separate, even if it contradicts the line of reasoning that, even if the rest of Cartographer stays as one repo, essentially? Because if you're not okay with that, then it's something we should iron out in the RFC. If you are okay with that, and the maintainers can decide where it goes, then yeah, the RFC can theoretically ignore it.
There's a little bit of question of like just whether there's like just a temporal drift here in terms of like Cartographer is moving towards or moving away from a monorepo model and towards multiple repos. Like then if just like conventions are the first, then like that's one thing. If it's like no, like permanently, like the desire is that Cartographer stays as a monorepo, but conventions is kind of over there, then that's clearly an indication that conventions are viewed as something else and lesser. And that's where I think like maybe we don't have alignment.
I think I'd say, to answer that question, like there's no RFC to make separate repos for anything in Cartographer right now. And I haven't heard discussion around doing that apart from our discussion about conventions.
But I'll remove that one bullet point, and then the question goes away. I know that doesn't actually go away, but like as far as the RFC is concerned, the question goes away.
Yeah, my 2 cents here from listening the 2 sessions is that we have 2 separate conversations here. One specific about convention services, or convention service being part of Cartographer. That's kind of more strategic. And the another one is more tactical, is how to do it. Yeah, separate repo, mono repo, and all of that. So what if it all comes down to the RFC process itself? It has some relationship there. So if like James said, probably in the future there will be more integrations, we should reach an agreement at this point on how to handle that, separate repo, monorepo, etc. So what about having an RFC for that, for deciding how to handle integrations, separate repo, monorepo, and we can have the conversation, the agreement documented publicly. And in the future, if someone else wants to contribute to Cartographer, we will need to go through the conversation of repos only about the content itself of the contribution. That's what I see. Probably I'm wrong, but
I'm not wholly opposed to that. I don't know if I'm not totally sure if it's necessary, but I would say even more before answering that, there are two other unresolved questions on the RFC. Do they need presumably they need resolution before we, or I don't know, do they need resolution? Are these blockers?
Could we
I
just
was just
take
going to remove them from the
time
RFC
for
and
1
add a
second
note.
on this issue?
Mhm.
Sorry, could we just take a beat on this this issue for a second? I'm not sure. I've seen Scott Rosenberg pop up a few times, and Scott, I just want to welcome you to our community meeting, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to ask questions if you had any. I think you are our first
He's gone.
non-VMware attendee at one of these meetings.
He's gone.
Oh, okay.
He's been dropping in and out through the thing.
yeah, but I believe he has some audio issues, but he already gave him a
think-
warm welcome.
Yeah, I think David welcomed him at the beginning, and then he
Okay.
promptly dropped, and then back.
But yeah, that's a milestone. It's
Sorry, I
our
missed the very
first
start.
non-VMware attendee. That's great. Yeah, you're right.
Awesome. Can we also just make a decision on this one? Can we just say, can we just like not talk about this RFC anymore, just make a decision right now? Is everyone
I
okay?
think- Overall, can I just say, like, I think the unresolved questions added more confusion than clarification. Like, I think the RFC stands on its own fine without those. I'm going to drop them. I'm going to add a small note, basically just saying, this is talking about the controller for conventions, not specific conventions. We're talking about things that exist today, not things that we could do in the future. I think that should help alleviate concerns.
And then can we all like reach a consensus, whatever that means, that we're going to accept this? Does anyone have a strong objection? Okay, so we're going to say that we're accepting this RFC, and then we will, Scott, can we make this a separate repo to start? Just because to me it's not clear that the release cycles are going to line up immediately. So can we start as a separate repo, and then if we decide that we want to go down the path and like sync up the release cycles for these two products, then we can merge it all into one.
My views remain the same on this.
Okay, does anyone else object to just creating a separate repo, putting it all there, and then if we want to sync up the release cycles?
It feels to me this is probably the best way to get moving, and it'll also help iterate on that repo more easily. And yeah, so that sounds good to me. And if it helps, I can help put together an RFC to help start splitting out parts that we think may not be always shipped with Cartographer, like possibly runnable. I think that was suggesting maybe that one, and maybe start that discussion separately, just to alleviate some of the concerns that Cartographer isn't going to be decomposed somewhat. Would that help a little bit for all?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think we start with convention services separate, and then it starts the conversation of what else should be separate, which I think is a good conversation to have.
Okay.
So yeah,
I would ask, does making a separate repo for a convention service need an RFC if we approved this RFC? Like that's the implementation of it, right? So I don't think we need an RFC to add convention service, right? Maybe I misheard. I thought that's what you were suggesting, James.
I think, do you know what? It's 20 to 8 in the evening here, so I think I've lost track of. I've gone around through a few circles. So, does somebody else want to try and have a stab at it? That was my attempt of just trying to unblock and move on.
I think James is saying that he's planning to open an RFC about repo structure moving forward, post moving convention service into the project as a separate repo. Is that right?
Yes, I think it's been quite a few conversations on this, and I don't know, but it's probably would just be good to get code moved in somewhere. And I'm not sure what the fallout of this other separate conversation or where we remain stuck here. But for me personally, I would just like to see some, Scott unblocked and putting some code somewhere, and then just iterating on that and being used as well and getting that feedback. And then people that feel strongly about where things live, we can figure that out. Maybe that is one for another day, but I think as a first step, it would just be good to kind of get code, iterate, and people using it and feedback in that approach.
I like it.
Okay, great. And if I can help, I'll help with whatever needs to be done. Maybe Scott, me and you can catch up together, and if there's anything, figure out how we create this new repo, and Josh maybe as well. And just maybe let's start that tomorrow to get the ball rolling.
Thanks, James.
Cool. Thank you all. That was really good. Okay, any other comment? Well, again, Scott Rosenberg, a warm welcome from all the team, and feel free to add any questions that you may have for the team. We are glad to have you here.
Yeah, no questions from my side, but loving Cartographer and excited to continue to use it. So thank you for
That's
great to be here.
great. So what about your experience so far using Cartographer? Honestly.
Definitely a steep learning curve, but has been going really well, and have been writing a lot of interesting supply chains and actually doing most of it in conjunction with TAP, but also using the open source Cartographer as well. So having a lot of fun so far.
Thank you. Yeah, we're definitely working on docs and enablement material to help with this steep learning curve. We are aware of that. Thank you.
If you have feedback,
but,
be really loud about it. We're really interested in hearing from users right now, for sure. Sorry.
Definitely. No, I'm putting together a bunch of notes on my side and everything throughout all the testing, and I'll share that hopefully in a few weeks once I have that all kind of laid out.
Awesome. We really appreciate it.
Definitely.
Hope you can join the Tansu TV show Wednesday. It's I believe it's 12 p.m. Pacific time. We will have a live coding session using Cartographer, deploying an app. So it will be fun. Hope you can join.
Definitely. And I'll be doing a webinar on tap with a lot of tough stuff on Cartographer on tomorrow. So should be fun as well.
Cool.
Looking forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Okay, that's great. Any other comment? We had a really productive session.
Yeah, we have a couple of other RFCs that we wanted to talk about.
Okay.
RFC9,
Yeah.
RFC18. RFC9 is geared towards, platform operator. We'll probably need, in order to create a good platform, we'll need to have more than just one inflexible supply chain. There are going to be different types of workloads that need different types of supply chains. One example is sometimes you'll need to grab source code and to build it into an image, and sometimes a user will come with a pre-built image. And so there need to be supply chains that can handle that situation. We need to decide how do we enable those platform operators. One option is, the option that we've already given them is that using label selectors, you can select from among multiple supply chains. So you could say there are 18 paths to prod and there are 18 supply chains, and that is possible today. The next step in terms of, and then I should mention that one of the things that we've done in TAP to handle this is that we've made the templates themselves essentially templates for multiple objects using YTT conditionals. So we say like, oh, in this step, you might get object A or you might get object B. And we've definitely gotten feedback from some users that YTT layer is a little confusing. So then third choice is in the supply chain to define steps in a supply chain and say, here's step 1, here's step 2, here's step 3. And step 1 is conditional, can stamp out 2 different templates. We could do that in one of 2 ways. We could either make it completely label based, as we do with the supply chain selection itself, and just say, if you see XYZ label, then stamp out this template here. Another option is to use field selectors. So for example, you could say, if you see XYZ field on the workload, then you should stamp out template A or template B. I'll pause there. There's some implications between those 2 choices, but I'm going to, I don't know if there are questions based on what I've laid out so far.
This is just asking a question, and it's probably, this goes back to probably some design decisions way back when, but I just wanted to ask this question, so nobody shoot me if it's a bad question. Was there a reason, has it been discussed about having, rather than using like a dynamic labeling on with workflows and things, using a Git-based approach to it? So something like a marker file or something in the Git repository that helps define these. So you kind of get that level, the level of control and approval over what the supply chain the selectors are? Or is it there is a reason, there's a design reason why we want to be able to dynamically, one developer could dynamically change a workload, whereas another developer on the same team could also dynamically change that. And you've got this strange no traceability of what developer is changing the workload. What is there a reason for this to move away from kind of a Git-based approach, or is there a possibility of having these things defined in the Git repo along with the source code?
My first reaction is that Cartographer is really not aware of any of the Git repository, right? a workload has a source location, and one of those source locations is Git, but Cartographer is never. I mean, part of this could be coming up with a manner to say like, okay, pull that from have Flux pick up the state of that Git repository and then expose those like whatever values you're mentioning there to Cartographer itself or to a further template, and then the template could make some decision. But the way Cartographer works right now, that would be necessary because the controller right now doesn't know what's in that Git repository.
I think backing away from the like specific technology decisions or interfaces or how things work, right? Like the goal of Cartographer is like to create Kubernetes-based sort of DSL for an operator to describe an application platform in a completely K8s native way, right? To say this is how this particular platform processes an application, and so the configuration isn't in the source code for a specific application, or isn't in the like workload definition for a specific workload in some cases, right? Or it's very controlled as to how that the application can influence a specific application, can influence the supply chain, to kind of keep that separation of personas. So you have kind of as an operator, you can define something that's reusable, kind of reduce sprawl for a lot of developers, which looks really different than how a lot of CI/CD, a single application CI/CD would look, because it's trying to pull apart those two things. But like, you could imagine checking a supply chain and a workload and your source code into a Git repo and automatically applying them, and making a specific application-specific version of this. It's just, a lot of the value, I think, of Cartographer is its ability to scale in an organization.
Yeah, it's just that thing where I've just kind of that abstraction that we have that we create for the developer that we say is to create a workload. That abstraction is a dynamically created thing which can change, and there's no traceability over that. So if you're working in a team of multiple developers on that microservice, one person could change that workload and the other person not. And so with the more complexity we add in around when we're talking about these things and labels and things, just from a usability point of view, it can be, and that traceability, it can be a little bit hard if you're offering a dynamic ways of changing things. That's really where my motivation is going for. But Shuma, I totally take your point. Git is one way, and so how do you do it for others as well? But that's where I'm going for this is Git, more Git, things in configuration in Git. Where they are,
Maybe if I tried to like give you the feature that you're looking for or something, like if you imagine the workload as it is today, but there's a special stub workload or something you could create that says pull the workload spec from this workload that's checked into the Git repo, and so as it's processing it, the params, instead of coming from the workload in the cluster, that actually looks into the Git repo and pulls them out and then uses those params instead, for example.
Like
that's interesting because like right now you could kind of achieve that by having cap and putting workload in a separate repo and then having cap sync to that separate repo, but then you need two repos, right? And that's maybe kind of a disadvantage for some workflows. See, we have a lot of questions based on that.
Zach?
Yeah, I was just going to check in with folks. I think this is a really interesting conversation, but it feels like a very different conversation than what the RFC is actually talking about. So I was wondering if we want to head to the RFC conversation, but maybe like James, this might make sense as an issue or something to write up as a UX we'd like to support, and maybe something we can put on the agenda and talk about explicitly. Because I don't think it's actually the same as the RFC that's on the agenda that we're chatting about right now.
Sounds good. I think it was more the dynamically in the headline was where I was kind of focusing on, and I think it's a good point. I can write that up.
I think it is kind of related in that when you're talking about dynamic behavior, selecting different parts of the supply chain, oftentimes you're doing that because it's application specific behavior, and so it leads you to the question of, well, should some of this configuration actually be, if we want application specific behavior, shouldn't some of that come from the application? And so I think it's it's related. It's just a kind of bigger philosophical question about the problem itself, if that makes sense.
Cool. Happy for the conversation to go where it needs to. Just wanted to sort of check in.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe the larger thing could be a larger RFC at the same time.
Scott, please.
Yeah, so I guess going back to the original question of the RFC, I definitely lean strongly towards the second option, where it's more context driven. Main reason is that if you look at the first example where we're using a label selector, if you scroll up a little bit, we're basically asking users to repeat themselves, where they basically have to say, here's my Git source with the Git repository and the tag or the branch. And also let me add this label that says, hey, yeah, that Git repository, I actually like, yeah, go use it. As opposed to just saying, the user specified a Git source location on their workload. Let's just go use it. If they didn't and they instead specified an image location, then go use that instead.
Yeah. So I'll say that it happens that I agree. I like the field selectors. The advocates of label selectors that I've talked to, one of the points is that each platform could have their own workload inspector, or we could write a universal workload inspector that could, when a supply chain or when a workload is submitted, could mutate the workload and add labels to that workload, so that it's not the developer that needs to repeat themselves. There would be some automation,
but
that
the
would do that
developer has to
repetition for you.
maintain that then, because then when they go edit the resource, then you have drift that's not accounted for, and it's a pain in the ass.
As I said, I agree with you, but I want to present the strongest case for the opposite side as well, and invite anyone else to jump in with even stronger arguments.
The one use case that I've been thinking about that's not accounted for by just using field selectors directly is the case where we're associating, you have your Tecton pipeline, which is associated to your workload through its own label matching mechanism. And so using field selectors in the supply chain, you wouldn't be able to make the association to like these other related objects. Whereas if you had some mechanism like a workload inspector, it could be a lot more intelligent about other resources that exist within the ecosystem.
I think you are completely right that the proposal as it is right now would have no way to know about some third object that was of some certain, had some GVK and some label. We could add it to here, but also nothing about this proposal precludes having that inspector that could handle that single use case. That's the other thing that I like about the field selectors is that labels themselves are a field on the workload. And so I feel like the advantages of labels are soaked up in the advantages of field selectors. And as such, I would only want to exclude the field selectors if we decided they were dangerous somehow. The other thing that I would say about field selectors is that there's a choice to be made. When we say field selectors, are we talking about just the fields of the workload or the fields of the entire templating context? The RFC, as it's written up right now, takes a position, talks about the entire templating context. The advantage there is that the behavior of the supply chain could truly be dynamic. It could be that I tend to go with the example of, let's say you have a convention, and the convention annotates a supply chain or annotates a deployment in some sort of way, and perhaps it annotates it in a way where Knative actually can't deploy deploy that K8s object anymore. It needs to be deployed with a regular deployment. With access to that entire templating context, that decision could be encoded in the supply chain. If we did not have that, we wouldn't have that dynamic behavior. And I think that there is an argument for not allowing such dynamic behavior, because it's very useful to be able to tell what's the path of this object going to be just from the point that you, like the moment the workload has been submitted, being able to plot out, this is the path that it's going to take. Whereas if we allow access to the entire templating context, that would not be possible. Zach, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of say this out loud and see if it makes sense. I think I'm actually, after proposing that James's conversation was slightly orthogonal, I think I'm making the connection on why it's actually really important here between these approaches. I think there's something to think about what is enabled or not enabled. If we're asking if we're having something that annotates the workload on a user's behalf, does that create problems if we do want to have a GitOps based workflow where people are modifying that workload in their Git repository and we're watching that, and it becomes sort of out of sync with like the sort of magic annotation thing that was happening somewhere, where if we are pulling stuff contextually out of the params, maybe we dodge that question entirely. I also might not be understanding this, but sort of saying that out loud.
I think my question was very similar, but a little more like directed towards an implementation. Isn't it pretty common? Like maybe it's not common with labels to have something that automatically adds a label and then you have to keep it in sync with whatever. But isn't it pretty common with annotations for like mutating webhook to look at the object as it's submitted and add annotations, and then it's okay if you submit it without them later because the mutating webhook deals with that. Like I think I've seen that pattern. Is there an issue with using that in this context? Wouldn't that kind of solve the problem? On the cluster, the workload would have the annotations that point it towards a particular path through the supply chain. Off the cluster, those annotations aren't there, and they're namespaced to be, always present in one place and not present in another place.
Yeah, I think with annotations, I've always treated them as things that tend to be added by things like automation, or use them to store metadata and various things as you learn controllers adding them to them and whatnot. Labels less so, but I don't know if that helps. Is that what you're saying, Stephen?
Yeah, like it seemed like, Scott, you had a concern about using, and Zach, you just expressed kind of the same concern about using labels. If they're automatically added, and you're checking your workload into a Git repo, then they get out of sync with what's on the cluster. But a common pattern with annotations, which we could also use in this case, I think, where we could use instead, is to have webhooks that specifically, keep them on the cluster and not on your in your Git repository. And does that solve the problem of option? I forget if it was 1 or 2. The non-field option 1. Yeah. Does that make option 1 look more attractive? If you replace the word label with annotation and you imagine there's a webhook there that solves the problem.
I guess I'm not sure what problem it's actually solving. Like an annotation is just another field that doesn't have to be consulted and looked at. Like you could just look at the original field rather than synthesizing a new field.
It would decouple the thing that looks at the workload and decides, is this workload a workload that takes source code from a Git repository versus an image, for example, or is this workload a workload that I don't know, needs to have other properties that we've talked about that we might do have dynamic supply chain behavior, and describe that in a concise series of declarative things, instead of taking your supply chain and coupling it to a bunch of field selectors and very specific things inside of the workload object.
I think for me, the challenge is that, or the thing that I don't like about that is that it feels to me like the platform operator, the workflow of that platform operator would first be, okay, I've got this use case that I need to have a supply chain able to handle. The first thing I'm going to do is figure out what in the workload will indicate to me that the user's in this use case. Okay, I figured that out. Now I'm going to create some workload inspector mutating webhook that's going to annotate the workload to say like, aha, I'm in this use case. And then I'm going to alter my supply chain so that the supply chain recognizes that label and handles that use case. And it feels like there's just a lot of extra steps in there where it could just be, I'm going to figure out what in my workload indicates that I'm in that use case. And then I'm going to tell my supply chain, look for that and handle that use case. I think both, I have no doubt that both can be correct, but one seems a long way around.
Well, remember we are at time, but Zach, please.
Well, I was just going to kind of plus one what I think what Shum was saying in terms of, I think the second option feels more traceable in that I can go directly to the supply chain to see like what is the thing that triggered this. And it also feels like something you can report up sort of resources if you want to easier. You can sort of say, I hit this condition versus like I have to go look somewhere else for this like map of did I apply XYZ label to a thing based on condition, and then how did that match to like supply chains over here? Sort of, at least at first blush, feels like it's maybe a little easier to sort of, the logic exists where it's sort of resolved, which maybe makes it feel a little more debuggable and understandable.
As we are at time, my what I intend to do to move us forward is to actually come down in the RFC and propose that we do the field selectors and take this out of a draft state and put it into so that people can mark approve or disapprove. And I'm not doing that to short circuit the conversation. Certainly if you have yeah, please feel free to drop in comments and let's all engage with those. But I think as we've been saying, we've got a number of RFCs open and we want to start closing some of them so that we can start write some code on them.
Oh, that's right. That's only for RFC 9. Yeah, please.
Sorry, I was gonna say, if you're doing that, could you just come up with some like standard examples of like field selectors that we might see, so we get like an idea of the extent of the syntax and how complicated the field selector definition might look like?
Yeah,
if we need to match, 4 different fields to match the supply chain, and then like a few other and then like this field matches to this path, this field matches to this path, just like a complicated example so we could get a sense of the syntax.
Yeah, I'll try to think of some hairy corner cases. And I welcome other people to drop in. I think right now mine will be like pretty synthetic and pretty arbitrary. So if you have use cases that you've been expecting to handle, and I may just start with some supply chains that exist out in the wild that have YTT and see how those would be translated into this new YTT-less world.
Love the approach of looking at it from the usability side and what having going from a design point of view of having those examples.
Great. Well, that was only RFC 9, so we'll have to leave discussion of RFC 18 for next session. Thank you all for your time kudos to Mari for being such a great note taker. Today was tough, so thank you, Mari. And without any further ado, see you next week. Thank you.